Welcome back to the podcast, Unbinding the Bible. This is episode 107, Revelation, Laying Waste the Great City. And in this episode, we will finish Revelation chapter 18 by looking at verses 9 through 24, which is an incredibly lengthy description of the fall and the destruction of Babylon. And as we'll see, based on my reading through the passage, but also a few things that I will point out, we will see why it is that in the end, Babylon itself will be judged and why that is good news for those in the world who, for any reason whatsoever, have experienced oppression or injustice at the hands of what Babylon is described as the Great Ones. And we'll take a look a little bit at why it is that the Lord judges Babylon. And so I'm excited to jump into this. We are rapidly moving through the remaining chapters of the book of Revelation, and Lord willing, won't be too far off in the near future when we will be finished with the book. But it's been a lot of fun so far, and right here again is a really powerful section in the book that I'm excited to jump into. So let's just get right into it. To begin this week's episode, allow me just to read Revelation 18, verses 9 through 24. And the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, "Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come." And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and slaves. That is, human souls. The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. And all shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea, stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning, "What city was like the great city?" And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, "Alas, alas, for the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her." Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, "So will Babylon the great city be thrown down with violence, and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters, will be heard in you no more. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all who have been slain on earth." Now that's quite a lengthy description, and I know I want to keep the podcast to a relatively decent length of time, and so probably won't comment on everything that is in here, but I do want to draw your attention to a couple of things, and the first one is where I am pulling the title for this episode, Laying Waste the Great City. So in verse 17, it says that these merchants of these wares that were listed in a very lengthy description, they're upset because in a single hour, all this wealth has been laid waste. And then, of course, you heard the repeated refrain, you great city, oh, the great city, the great city, the great city. And we've looked at this at length before, talking about Babylon and the idea that it is the great city. And in verse 23, towards the very end of the passage, when we listed all these things that will be no more, and Babylon will be thrown into the sea with a great millstone hung around its neck. And it says in verse 23, for your merchants were the great ones of the earth. And I think the thrust of this, the great city and the merchants being the great ones, and the merchants and those who were selling all of these fine wares are in fact the ones who are the most distraught when the great city is no more. And this reminds me, I think, of a passage from Matthew 20 where Jesus is attempting to address his own disciples and their desire, particularly James and John, if you remember, for them to sit at his right and his left in his kingdom. And James and John's request and desire to be great in the kingdom. And so Jesus has to address his disciples because they get upset at James and John for requesting this. And Jesus, no doubt, is shaking his head and trying to realize, how am I going to explain this to you again? But it says Jesus called them to him and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, this is a passage that's fairly familiar to us, but I want to make a few points about it. And the first is that greatness in the kingdom, particularly the kingdom that Jesus came to set up and to reign as king in, is a kingdom where he didn't come to be served, but came to serve and to give his life ultimately as a ransom for many. And so he contrasts the way kingdoms work in the Gentile world, where the great ones are those who exercise authority over other people, or who have more power or more wealth or more responsibility or more talent than the rest of the world, and therefore they are honored appropriately. Jesus says in his kingdom, if you want to be first, if you want to be great, you need to be a servant, you need to be a slave. Now, it's interesting that Jesus would choose to use these terms because slaves, of course, had no rights. They were responsible to their master, and their master either could take care of them or could abuse them. It was sort of at the master's whim. Now, to be a slave in Jesus' kingdom, and Paul talks a lot about this throughout his letters, is to be a slave to Christ, to the one who chose to lay down his life for us. And so slavery in this idea, in this context here, is that we submit ourselves under, not over, authority over other people, but we come under one another and we serve on our knees with a towel, the way Jesus did. And yet it is right in the middle of this really lengthy description in verses 12 and 13 of all of these things that the merchants of the earth mourn over because they have lost. And it lists an incredibly lengthy list of purple and fine linen and jewels and gold and silver and pearls and all kinds of scented wood and all kinds of articles of ivory and on and on and on and on and on. Frankincense, myrrh, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep. It's a really long list, which ironically enough, or intentionally enough from John's perspective, there are 28 items listed here. And 28 is a significant number in the book of Revelation. I think we've touched on this before, but the word the Lamb is used 28 times in the book of Revelation, I believe, as the product of 7 times 4. 7, of course, being the number of completeness, the number of perfection. There are 7 letters that John, or 7 churches to whom John is writing. The 7 spirits of God who are before his throne is a reference to the complete, all-seeing eye of the Holy Spirit. And again, 7 is a number of completeness. And 4, as we have seen with the reference to the 4 corners of the earth, east, west, north, south, this type of idea is 7 times 4, listing all of these items is a reference really to all of the earth. Like, these are things that have come from the ends of the earth. And I love what N.T. Wright has to say about this. I think it's very helpful and very clear. But he says that John does not say that the gold, silver, precious stones, and the rest were bad things which nobody should have celebrated in the first place. Interestingly, Many of them find an honored place in the New Jerusalem of chapter 21. Rome was able to bring all these fine commodities listed in verses 12 and 13 from the ends of the earth. Among the things John mentions are goods that would have come from India, China, and Africa, as well as Arabia, Armenia, and beyond. This was truly a worldwide trade. But the giveaway point comes at the end of verse 13. John has built up a marvelous catalog of luxury goods as well as the basics of trade, flour, wheat, cattle, and so on. But then, right at the end, we find the horror. Among the goods are bodies. Yes, human lives. When you worship idols, the idols demand sacrifices. When you worship Mammon, the money god, or Mars, the war god, or Aphrodite, the sex goddess, they will demand sacrifices, all right. And some of those sacrifices will be human. The point that N.T. Wright is making is what I read for us right in the end of verse 13. John has described wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, and chariots, and slaves. That is, human souls. If we drop back down to verse 23, where we're told that for your merchants were the great ones of the earth, the connection John wants to make for the reader, and the connection I want to help us make for you as the listener, is that when you are in a kingdom like Babylon, who's interested in making itself great, and your great ones are the merchants, your great ones are the wealthy, your great ones are the people who have made trade and who have made monetary wealth and who have made advancement in the kingdom of Babylon. Those are the people that are most revered and most honored and most loved in the city. What happens undoubtedly is that power, money, and sex, which are the ultimate three idols that seem to always wreak havoc in our world, those three things always suck into their grasp human lives. Now, we know about slavery, and slavery for economic reasons is almost always something that is present in virtually every society. It's sadly not even absent from our own country's history. But believe it or not, in the first century, many slaves, both male and female, were sexually exploited by their masters, and they lived in constant fear of them. We have history and stories today of masters who sexually abused and sexually raped and violated the slave women. And of course, Michael Gorman, in his book, Apostle of the Crucified Lord, reminds us that that could happen for men or women, slaves or masters. It doesn't matter. And sometimes genders were conflicted in that way. But one of the saddest things and one of the tragedies for the great city is that when commodities become your number one goal, when wealth and greatness and prestige become your goal, when making a name for yourselves and making your own name great becomes your goal, human lives will be trampled in the process. And for Babylon to identify the great ones of the earth as the ones who are most important in their society, they trample over those who are the least important. In fact, in the passage immediately before the one I read, which I read in last week's episode, verses 7 and 8 of Revelation 18 say this: As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. Since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire. For mighty is the Lord God who has judged her. You see, in these two verses immediately before the passage I just read, it's Babylon's boast is that she is not a widow. What's strange about this is that widows are the very type of people that the Lord continually sides with. He sides with those who have no power. He sides with those who are hurting, who have experienced loss. He steps into the midst and is more or less willing to judge a nation, if you will, by the way that it chooses to treat its least significant people. And yet for Babylon, she is boasting and saying, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. Now, I know if you're just listening, don't be confused. It's not mourning like morning and evening. This is mourning, wailing, crying, weeping over a loss, something that you once had, that you loved, that has been taken away from you. This is the weeping that we oftentimes hear Jesus referring to, the weeping and the gnashing of teeth. It's this state of being absolutely distraught over something that you loved being taken away from you. And in Revelation, the idea for mourning, the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn for her. They threw dust on their heads. All the shipmasters and seafaring men threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned. The merchants of the earth will mourn over her. And a while back in the book of Revelation, when we were all the way back in chapter 1, episode 45, Revelation, he is coming with the clouds. We spent a little time talking about this idea that every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all tribes of the earth will wail on account of him, or will mourn on account of him. And I won't go into all the details there, but one of the elements of that podcast episode was that I tried to get to the bottom of what does it mean for everyone to mourn on account of Jesus. And in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Well, you have here a group of people who are mourning, but who are mourning explicitly because they are not comforted. And so ultimately what's happening with Babylon and with Jesus is for Jesus in the Beatitudes to express, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." If we're talking about mourning on account of Jesus, then the type of mourning that will receive comfort are those people who mourn that there is not more presence of Jesus in the world, or that there is not more righteousness present in their own lives. They are aware of their sinfulness. They are aware of the brokenness in this world. They have personally experienced it. They have felt it, and it causes deep sadness and deep sorrow. And Jesus explicitly says for people who find themselves in that position, comfort awaits them, because he chooses to have solidarity and to join us in that sadness and in that grief. But in Revelation 18, the judgment that is coming, the judgment that verse 20 says, "For God has given judgment for you, O heavens and saints and apostles and prophets." He has given judgment for you against her. Why? Because now it is the time for judgment to happen to the very people, institutions, structures, systems that have caused mourning and brokenness and sadness and destruction and injustice for the rest of the world. And so there is always two sides to the same coin. God's judgment for you, God's salvation for one group who longs for his redemption, is God's judgment for another group that is perfectly content with the way life is going at the very present time. And this is why, even though Revelation will say God has given judgment for you against her, we're not to imagine or not to conjure up within ourselves a desire to carry out this kind of judgment by ourselves. This has been a problem since the fall of man, and that is that people believe themselves to be capable of making God's judgment calls on the world and acting out those judgments. But many of you probably know or would remember in chapter 12 of Romans, Paul says, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." And then Paul reminds us, which I think in language similar to Revelation, when he says, if God is for us, who can be against us? And in verse 20 of Revelation 18, we're explicitly told for the heavens to rejoice, and the saints and the apostles and the prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. So God's judgment is two sides of the same coin. Those who longed for God's arrival, those who long for true justice, not only for the world, but also in their own hearts and lives, and are willing to spot injustice in their own hearts and lives every bit as quickly as they're able to spot it in the world outside of them. For those who have longed for God's coming in his presence, his judgment is going to be like salvation. And for those who have abused human lives and human souls in the process of getting wealthy and getting rich, exploiting people for their own desire for power, sex, money, you have it, you name it, God's coming will be seen purely as judgment. So when Paul says in Romans 12 for us to leave it to the wrath of God, we already know how the Lord will repay. We already know how the wrath of God works. Paul's already mentioned it in Romans chapter 1. In verse 24, 26, and 28, when men or women choose no longer to acknowledge the Lord, no longer to acknowledge his ways, no longer to live according to the way he set the world up because they believe they know better, it's not as if God stands there with a lightning bolt and strikes them down. We're told 3 times in a row in Romans 1 that God gives them up. He gives them over. He hands them over. He pulls back his protective, guiding hand and allows people to freely experience the consequences of the actions that they take. His grace and his kindness is by holding out the offer of life and holding out the offer of a better way. But if people grow content with the way they have things and begin to view this as not necessarily important for them to want to know how God's ways are meant to rearrange their own, then God will allow them to experience those consequences. This is what is happening to the great city. This is what is happening to any empire or any nation or any system of thought or any ideology, which does in ways that we don't oftentimes even see, but which moves itself forward and makes its own name great while causing human beings to suffer. And the very last verse of Revelation 18, I think, sums this up well. It says, "In her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all who have been slain on earth." And I love this about Revelation, because the point of the coming of Jesus and the establishment of his church through the Spirit has always had a universal focus in mind. It has always had a worldwide expansion in mind. And here, John catches up into the vision the fact that all who have been slain on earth. And for a brief moment, John separates the fact that these might not even be saints and prophets. He says the blood of prophets and saints, which we know, the martyrs in chapter 5, those who are clothed in white robes in Revelation chapter 7, our eye has been focused exclusively on Christians and what Christians might stand to lose as a result of their faithful witness to Jesus. But here John reminds us that Babylon is no respecter of persons. Babylon abuses and mistreats people from any religion or from no religion. They don't really care. They don't think about life this way. They're focused on becoming great, and they do not mind who they trample over in the process. And so what's valuable, I think, for Christians is to be aware of the fact that regardless of a person's religious orientation, or regardless of whether a person happens to be a Christian or profess Jesus, God's loving care and concern for their protection and for justice for them is just as strong as it is for his own people. And his own people ought to be aware of that. And so the Lord demonstrates a universal concern for the downtrodden of all who have been slain on earth. You know, we're in an age right now where there is a lot of abuse coming to the surface. Psychological and emotional abuse is a real thing. Sexual abuse has an ugly stain in our history, but it is now becoming more in the limelight, even with Christian churches. And pastors who have found themselves worshiping, as N.T. Wright pointed out, whether you worship Mammon, the money god, or Mars, the war god, or Aphrodite, the sex goddess, lives are going to be sacrificed. And that's sadly what is happening. And we have some type of leaders sometimes who desire for control, or they want to be in power, or they want to be well known, or they want to have a great reputation, or they do have secret lusts driven under the surface, which play themselves out into real lives and destroy real human beings. Sexual abuse is an incredibly destructive thing in our world, and it finds its way into the heart ideologies of all sorts of places, even in churches. And so this is why when Jesus is describing in Luke 17 about the coming judgment, he makes a reference to Lot. And remember the days in Lot's people were eating and drinking and whatever, but the Lord was about to judge Sodom and Gomorrah. And then Jesus makes this really strange statement in verse 32 of Luke 17, where he just says, remember Lot's wife. That's the whole verse. Remember Lot's wife. If you want a good memory verse this week, I suppose it could be that one. And what is Jesus referring to? Well, he's referring to Lot's wife, who we are told when the angels came down and rescued Lot and his wife and his daughters and their husbands, or attempted to rather, the husbands never believed what was going on. So only Lot and his daughters and his wife were going to be rescued. And yet when they were being pulled out of Sodom and Sodom was about to be destroyed, they were told explicitly by the angels, do not look back. Head straight for the hills. This is where your salvation is to be found. And Lot's wife turned back, and we're told that in that moment became a pillar of salt. The idea that was being communicated in Genesis, and the idea that Jesus is reminding his listeners of in Luke chapter 17, is to check those heart longings buried deeply within us, where the reason Lot's wife turned back and was therefore destroyed was because her heart loved Sodom. Her heart loved the things that were taking place there. She had made a home in Sodom. It had become home to her. And her heart longed for its continuance. Her heart hated the fact that she was going to be separated from these things that she loved. She was concerned to find out what their fate was going to be. And so she turned back to look. The angels explicitly told her not to, but to look to the hills where God's salvation awaited, because they wanted her heart redirected toward him and his ways. The same thing is happening in Revelation 18. The reason why so much weeping and mourning is going on is because things that meant a lot to the merchants or to the kings or to the great ones or to the shipmasters and seafaring men, this is all economic prosperity that came, sadly, at the expense of real human lives. And John is here to say that this is in fact judgment for those who have suffered, while he is judging against those causing the suffering. And so this is the way Revelation describes judgment. This is the way Paul describes it in Romans chapter 1. This is the way the Old Testament talks about the Lord's judgment. The Lord will talk about destroying people, and then the very next verse, he will explain that such and such a nation is going to come in and is going to destroy them. When Jesus was constantly warning his people about the judgment, if you listen closely to what he's saying, he's a lot fewer times talking about the end of all time judgment, and rather warning his own people what their fate is going to be if they continue in the same mindset toward the Romans that they had when Jesus was there. And sadly, very few of the Jews listened to Jesus, because less than 40 years after Jesus left, they all experienced destruction at the hand of the Romans. And here, John is describing exactly what it is going to be like in the end for any nation, any kingdom, any system, any ideology that has its heart and its mind set on its own economic advancement to the exclusion of real human lives. The kingdom of God is concerned first and foremost with human lives, with human flourishing, with human advancement. And it is willing to sacrifice the trade and the commerce and the wealth that one could obtain if you forgot about people and instead focused on the people themselves, seeing people as the treasure, which is ultimately what the Lord himself does. He chooses Israel and chooses to put his blessing on them and calls Israel as his people, his treasured possession. So yeah, as N.T. Wright points out, at the end of the book of Revelation in chapter 21, we will see lots of these same gold, silver, precious jewels, fine linens, all that stuff coming back to the surface, but it is going to be in service of people, not at their expense. And so that's how the two kingdoms, the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of God, intersect. It's how they collide. And depending upon which side of that you and I are on, will depend on whether or not we see that, the loss of all of that greatness, as a sad thing or as an exciting thing. Which side of that line are we on? What will our lives feel like to us if all of the wealth we have accumulated, or all of the popularity we have accumulated, or all of the power, or all of the prestige we have accumulated for ourselves, if that is taken away, will we experience that as loss, or will we experience that as salvation? That's the question that Revelation is asking us. That is the question I think we need to answer. And so that's all the time I really want to take in Revelation 18. I know that was kind of just a little flyby, a little surfacey, and I love it though. I think this is right in line with where we're going. We'll look at Revelation 19 in several weeks. I have another By the Book episode coming up for you. I have several sermons that I know I've been thinking about putting on the podcast, and I'm not yet sure when I intend to do that, but I probably will do that sometime soon. I got another great review this week, so thankful for that, and a new supporter of the podcast. So thank you so much for your encouragement from the financial side of things as well. It always means a bunch to me to be able to continue to do this for you, try to produce episodes that you enjoy listening to, and share with you things that are going on in my life. If you'd like to reach out, I'd love to hear from you. Comments or questions, thoughts, concerns, anything really, prayer requests. You can contact me at unbindingthebible@gmail.com. I am on Facebook. Many of you found me there, on Instagram as well. And thank you so much for continuing to support, continuing to listen, continuing to offer encouragement. And I would love if you want to leave me a rating or review, or both. And if you would like to become a supporter of the podcast, you can find a link at the bottom of the show notes of this episode or any episode, and that'll take you and give you instructions on how to do that. So thanks so much for tuning in. Have a great week.